fried Mars bars these days. But the Scots have always been different, and frankly they've always been at war with the English. Now the general election is around and all these decisions about the UK and all the rest of it breaking up. I'm not going to do that because we don't do politics. I'm going to do the background. I'm going to do the history of why Scotland ended up dominated by the English. Now, I'm proud of my ancestors. Part of the Allen clan, the Crawfords, were a bloodthirsty and uncompromising crew who lived partly in the Highlands but came down to the Lowlands often, into England, pillaging and robbing, doing whatever they could. They would break into a town and take it over, and if they didn't like the look of the place, they'd just raze it to the ground. Sadly, we never got as far as Swindon town centre. Never mind. As a boy, I wondered, when I was in Scotland, how this proud land had become dominated by the English. It seemed extraordinary, the Scots are so proud of their heritage, and everything associated with their history is insular. Scotland for the Scottish. So this is the story, this little speech is the story of the underlying reason why Scotland ended up being ruled by Westminster. I suppose it started with the fact that Queen Elizabeth I died childless, and therefore there was no English monarch to carry on. And so what did they do? They went up to Scotland and they got hold of James IV of Scotland, son of Mary Queen of Scots, who'd been knocking around for a long time, and they proclaimed him James I of England and Scotland, and Britain was born. And that was the start of it all. And so James I became the first Stuart, the first ruler of Scotland and England. But things were not happy. Scotland retained its own parliament, it retained many of its own cultures, its economic circumstances and background, and there were lots of conflicts, mostly on economic policy and foreign policies. It wasn't a happy marriage, really. But then came along a different sort of approach to things, and it started with this man, William Paterson, he with the curly hair. He was born in Scotland in 1658 and made a fortune out of what we called mercantile trade at that time, buying and selling stuff wherever he could find it, and he was quite a financier. And those were the days, don't forget, when there were few rules and regulations. People decided to do something, they did it, and anybody who got in the way got flattened. So he made his fortune. He actually founded the Bank of Scotland. He was instrumental in founding the Bank of England, believe it or not. And his theory was that any kingdom, no matter how small, i.e. Scotland, could build a successful global empire by taking strategic territories and controlling trade. Now the English had, of course, been with their navy, been in charge of the world for a long time at that point. But he had a brilliant idea, and he decided that he would settle in Panama. He would create a new trading position in what we call the Isthmus of Panama these days. In those days it was called Darien for some reason, and what he planned to do was to set up a trading post here, and from that position he would be able to control all of the trade in the Atlantic and the Pacific. But the grand idea was that they would take trade from here and trundle it across the Isthmus of Panama and sail it into the Pacific. What a splendid idea, how clever that was. Of course, he'd never actually seen the Isthmus of Panama, and if you look at it on the map, it doesn't look all that much, does it? But of course, the interior land is an absolutely impenetrable jungle, and full of diseases and terrible, terrible things. So that was his view. He was going to be in charge of what he called the trade of Europe and Americas with China, India and Japan, the door of the seas and the key of the universe. That was his grand plan. So you've got to give it to him. He was a big ruler. So he came back with this scheme. He went to Scotland, he'd been abroad doing his mercantile work, and he came back and he decided that he would set up this trading post, and he persuaded a lot of sensible people at that time that this was the way to go, and both the Dutch and the English agreed that they would support his venture, and then they backed out, and Scotland was left on its own with this grand idea, because the good old English East India Company had decided that they would pull the rug out from under him and leave him to get on with things as best he could. So he went out into Scotland and he asked the Scottish people to invest in this expedition, and they did, to the tune of somewhere between 500,000 and probably £1 million at that time, which was their gross domestic product for a couple of years. It's a huge sum of money, billions in today's money. And so everybody, as they say, every Scot who had £5 to spare invested in the Darien scheme. All the banks did. Anyone who was anyone. I can't think of anything equivalent to that. There was the dot-com bust, if you remember, back a while ago, where there was a huge investment in things that sort of disappeared. But this was their way to the future. And of course, they all clamoured onto it. They wanted to go and settle there. He offered them positions in the company. He offered them a tremendous return on their investment. And so on the 12th of July 1698, he left with 12 ships, and they went to go and establish their trading post on Darien, or the Isthmus of Parabat. So by the time they got there, they realised that it was just horrendous. They struggled ashore. They renamed the land most arrogantly New Caledonia, and they said that the capital of it would be called New Edinburgh. And their first task was to dig the graves of the 500 people who died within the first month from various things like yellow fever and black fever and everything else. And it just went from bad to worse. And 7 months after arriving, they had about 1,000 people dead, and it was a disaster. But news didn't travel quickly in those days, and before news got back that this wasn't about, another 6 more ships set sail, with another 1,300 excited Scots coming along to make their fortune. And at the end of it all, only one of those ships returned, and only a handful made the return journey. They paid the price. So they lost all the investment, and the result of that was that the Scottish economy was absolutely broke. It was just broke. People had given their savings, the banks had invested, everything had happened, and the country was just absolutely crippled. And that's when the cunning English came along and said, we'll offer you a settlement. And so the Act of Settlement of 1707, you might have heard of in the debates over the UK and all the rest of it, where Scotland agreed to become subservient to England and to be ruled by Westminster. Bad decision, but never mind. And that was it. That was it. That, more than anything else, is why. I've always wondered why. Why did Scotland give up its independence? That's why. So Scotland forever, but sadly, not at the moment.
John, you can stay.